You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Requard, and my father, Jake. As always, we are recording this for my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're recording all of these and putting them out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. I'm talking to you doing this podcast tonight from Rayford, North Carolina, where your mom grew up, and from Aunt Wanda's house, Aunt Wanda's dining room.
Which is a wonderful place to be.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very happy that you get to be there with so many wonderful parts of our family, and thankfully you sound good over there. So,
Yeah.
I think we're in for a really good episode tonight.
Yeah.
We are reviewing Hollow Pursuits, which is Season 3, Episode 21 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This debuted on April 30th, 1990, but it has an in-world star date of 43807.4, which we covered a little bit last time. But before we got into this episode, Dad, I was actually posed a question by someone on Twitter who is eagerly awaiting our podcast.
Oh my!
But they had a question of, in the future, do people pursue vegan diets in the 24th century if you have something like a replicator? And before we got into Hollow Pursuits, I wanted to explore this a little bit, just what you thought. See what you thought of the question.
Well, it's an interesting question, and of course you're popping it on me, and it's one of those things like, okay, for what we know about 24th century, 23rd century technology and so forth, and there's food replicators.
Mm-hmm.
Since you're not killing any animals, and if you still wanted a good beefsteak and you just have the replicator do it, and it's all, protein synthesizers and that sort of thing, is even if you have a synthesized steak, are you still staying vegan?
Well, one thing that
I guess it gets into what the absolute definition of veganism is.
Well, so the absolute definition of veganism is something that uses absolutely no animal products whatsoever. So, no eggs, no meat, no milk. I think to a certain extent, no honey. And I think some even go as far as like they don't want anything that involves animal labor either, which
So
is
what about seafood or fish?
no, I don't think that they do that. I think there are some people who are just pescatarians
Right.
and
Yeah.
stay away from like all land animals because they think that's cruel. Where fish is a different thing, like you catch them. I think that you bring up a really good point. I think it should be noted that when we watch series like Enterprise, Enterprise went out with a kitchen that had a chef and a full pantry
Mm-hmm.
that seemed to be serving like homemade food made there every day.
Mm-hmm.
Like even T'Pol had her like own plomeek stew made for her. I think Archer had a steak every time we saw him have dinner, but I I don't remember how they handled food exactly on the Enterprise or the Enterprise A. I know when they had dinner,
Oh, you're talking about the original series?
the original series and the movies, because the only time that I don't remember them eating any time like from the original series. I remember them having like some sort of function and there was like food on a table.
They had a
But
replicator because remember there was the one time when they uh, had to beam the Air Force pilot onto
right.
the Enterprise, and they beamed up the Air Force security guard, and The transporter operator made him chicken soup in that replicator.
Right. Okay. And then there is also that meal that they have on in Star Trek Six: The Undiscovered Country with the
Yes, right.
Klingon delegation. That's
Yes,
at
right.
a table and there's actually
Yeah,
people serving them, and we
yeah,
actually do see a kitchen
yeah.
on the Enterprise later on when they're investigating the assassination of Gorkin.
Who was the actor that played the chef in the one episode of Enterprise where?
Oh, Jonathan Frakes.
Oh, that's right. Jonathan Frakes was
Yeah,
it?
Riker stands
Yeah,
in
yeah,
as like
yeah.
the
That's right.
holographic chef.
Right.
But it's also important to note on Voyager they have a full kitchen with Mr. Neelix who's running
Yeah,
their mess
yeah,
hall essentially. They
yeah.
don't have a 10 forward.
No.
It's one thing that I thought to consider with this question of like replicators and veganism in the future. You know, you brought up the idea that if you like took cultured cells from a living animal, you could kind of, replicate a beefsteak or something like that. So foreseeably, and you could probably have this on the USS Enterprise D as we speak about the ship. You could have something like 3 or 4 cows that not only produce milk but also let you draw meat cells for cultures. We know that they have like a hydroponic garden and an arboretum, so it's foreseeable that you could have like an indoor farm on the ship
Well, you
that you could
really,
just draw cells from and make all the
you,
ingredients you need for a meal.
well, from what I understand from how they're making some artificial meat products now, they're taking animal cells and putting them in culture and
Yes.
growing them out, um, so that as long as you kept a supply of viable, you know, like host cells that you could, expand, you wouldn't really need an animal as long as you could keep that cell line alive.
I also have another theory of what's going on in the future. I kind of wanted to run by you. What if we're thinking about this the wrong way? We're thinking about the ideas of plant and animal proteins. You know, one thing that they also have in the future is synthahol, which is the
Hmm.
substance that allows them to have all the like I guess social lubricants, but none of the deleterious effects. Is the
Right.
quote. Um, if you take the toxic aspects out of alcohol, is it still alcohol?
You have to say no.
So synthahol is not the same thing as alcohol. I think that we would be able to establish.
It would be interesting to know if anybody, again, this is science fiction and it's made up, but
Right.
what would the difference in the molecular structure of synthahol be versus alcohol? Because
Well,
synthahol implies that it's an alcohol, but
yes.
ethanol is ethanol. But do you add some other methyl groups or amine groups or something to regular alcohol so that it has a different effect? So I think this is all
Exactly.
theoretical
Well,
or fantasy chemistry.
well, fancy chemistry, but thinking about it in like 24th century application, and we are working with like impossible meats and
Right.
lab grown foods now. One thing that I considered is that in the replicators themselves, the protein that they're resequencing isn't plant-based protein or animal-based. It's purely synthetic,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a synthetic protein that they have found some way in the 24th century. I don't know what they draw like the base amino cells from,
Oh,
but
the amino acid sequence. Right.
yes, I don't know where they draw the base from. Like, do they start with beef? Do they start with chicken? But
Right. Right.
essentially, they create this substance, and the substance can be replicated into anything and have any flavor. Because one thing that they note in the replicators, Margot and I were watching the episode after Data's Day. Oh, it's the one where O'Brien's former captain, the one who's hunting down Cardassians,
Mm-hmm.
has to be captured, and O'Brien and Keiko are having this conversation about the replicators and like replicating food, and how the replicators don't really create the taste of like real food. They come very close, but you can
Hmm.
tell that it's a replicated
Hmm.
meal versus an actual home cooked something. And they kind of have this, moment where they revel in the idea of having a home cooked meal. And even O'Brien's like, well, I'm gonna have to make you like Irish food on the replicator, so it's
Right.
not gonna taste the same.
Hmm.
So even if you have this resequenced protein substance in the 24th century that they're using to make everything from vegetables to meat to desserts to everything, it's still not the same thing as our regular food. Just like synthahol isn't real alcohol either. Like, and I think there has to be the possibility in the 24th century that if we've expanded out into space and that we are in some sort of intergalactic congress with all these other sorts of species, why would we still be bound by eating things that are plant and animal based? Like, what if you had like I know this sounds stupid, but like a silicate based protein, or just, the wonders could be abound. And like you said, it is a little bit of fantasy chemistry, but by the 24th century, you would hope that the
Right.
possibility is there that we've made the leap past the plant animal,
Well,
I
yeah,
guess, boundary.
we'll have to consider that further. And the only thing I can say is that I'm sure that from the Klingon perspective, you could never replicate a good bowl of gok.
Or like, replicate a targ, you have to kill a targ right there on the
Right.
ship.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's jump into hollow pursuits.
Okay.
I think that was a good exploration of the question.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
the episode, it's kind of hard to introduce the episode and give it kind of a central narrative, because the entire narrative is centered for the first time around an ancillary character in Lieutenant Reginald Barclay, who is a new and brilliant engineer on the Starship Enterprise, who is a diagnostics engineer. And when we start the episode, we find him in a holodeck version of Tenford, where he's kind of living out his confident fantasies of telling his boss, Geordie LaForge, um, to kind of get off his back. He also gets into a scuffle with Commander Riker when Riker tries to exert authority over him over insubordination. And there's also a clear sexual and physical attraction that Barclay has for Deanna Troy that he constantly plays out on the holodeck in various forms, even though we only see two of them. We see
Hmm.
Deanna kind of in the femme fatale role here, in the bar scene. And then we also see her as the, I think, goddess of inspiration or desire. We'll get there.
Goddess of empathy. I think it was. Yeah.
Goddess of empathy,
Yeah.
which is an interesting place to start.
Right.
But so, this is the first time where we really have a an episode about a character played by um
Dwight. What's his,
played by Dwight Schultz, who
yeah.
had previous fame before he came on the Next Generation as I think he was in the A
He
Team.
was in the A team, original A team with George Papard and so on. Yeah, I think.
Like, I'm trying to remember like his character's name in the A Team for some reason. I just can't remember it
Yeah, I don't
for the life
remember.
of me. But like, he was fantastic, and he's one of the original cast members. But Dwight Schultz had a very long and successful career as a member of the A Team before he showed up here, and he had showed up in other shows, including Hill Street Blues. So in some ways, like Dwight Schultz is coming onto the show not as an unknown, but this is a episode built entirely around a guest star. And I can't think of another episode that they've done that where they've actually centered the point of view as well on him. From
Well,
a writing
yeah.
perspective, it's very unique.
Well, it is, and it gets into comments we made about season three, where the story, the writing is so much tighter. And I'd made a note, written a note separate from my word process note that it really focuses on talks as an ancillary character Barclay's personal psychology relative
Hmm.
to the contamination problem that shows up, so that those two facets of the story are linked pretty well together. And
Yes.
as the episode goes on, it's explained how his psychology, his non-confidence in himself, ends up figuring out what this contamination problem that's causing all kinds of engineering problems.
So, you're kind of jumping around all over the place, but this is kind of an episode that's kind of hard to pin down narratively.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
we are going to jump over around the place. Everyone at home, if people are like, "What are they talking about?" Go watch the episode; it'll make sense. This is one of the few times where we're giving you that warning.
Yes.
Um, so, from the character perspective of Barclay himself, he's unique in the fact that you clearly have someone who is this brilliant diagnostics engineer, but is suffering from an intense and acute anxiety to the point where we talked previously during the Tin Man episode about characters that are neurodivergent versus neurotypical. I think in many ways. Um, Barclay falls on the more neurotypical side of the spectrum, but it's very clear that this man is dealing with a severe anxiety disorder or some sort of crippling anxiety that is causing him to have such social breakdowns. It is a little bit. Jordy will say early on, like, how did he get here on the Enterprise? How is this guy considered, so good that he ended up having to be a burden under me? Um,
And
I think
yeah,
that's interesting
yeah. I
to
mean,
have a character like this.
they sort of in the beginning, when Barkley, kind of fumbles from the beginning, and uh, Geordi starts talking to Riker, and then they talk to Picard, and information comes out that even during Barclay's academy days, he tended to be seclusive.
Hmm.
Um, they say, well, how did he get to be a Starfleet officer? And they said, well, Picard says he was highly recommended by Captain Gleason. And then uh, Riker and Geordi say, well, look, did Gleason not do you a favor? Was he just trying to Captain Zukov of the or Captain Gleason of
Captain
the
Gleason.
USS Zukov? Did he just kind of dump Barclay on and say, oh, this guy's really good, so get rid of him?
I
And the
I
last
think it's
comment,
A and B.
yeah, and the last comment is, what's the basis of his anxiety? And it seems like he's shy. Um, he has no social confidence, and that's sort of the basis of what I got from his anxiety as to what he's having difficulty fitting in, and thus to compensate, it gets into this over fantasization on the holodeck.
So, two things. I think we both agree that like this episode and future episodes, not only in Next Generation but in Voyager, because he later becomes head of the Pathfinder project that helps Janeway and the crew of the Voyager get home.
Mm,
But one thing about Barclay is that despite his brilliance, it's very clear that he is not necessarily able to function in a typical organizational hierarchy that you see in a place like the Enterprise, where like it's very clear being the flagship that they expect the best of the best, and that like
hmm
there's
hmm
an there's an assumption that if you've made it to the Enterprise D, you've really made it, and this is a place for your career to like really start going places, even if you're a lieutenant. Um, and it seems like there's this kind of expectation by Riker and Geordi, especially, to keep that reputation intact.
hmm
Because there's many times where they talk about Barclay kind of from the idea of like, well, he presents the possibility of embarrassing us.
hmm
And to get to your question of like what his actual psychological thing is, like I think there are definitely people who have such crippling social anxiety that it's not just shyness, they literally can't stand to be around people. And Barkley later says it, he's that guy that tries to go to a party with lines so he can have conversations with people, but he later ends up in a corner, like looking like, trying to look at a plant like he's fascinated by it.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think he goes to the party at all in the first place. I think
No,
in a real world, and I've met characters like these, I've lived with characters like these. Um, I think that this is a very real person that you can see day to day struggling in the world.
no, I think you're right because you say that he says that he wants to go to the parties, and he even makes up opening lines to get into conversations, but he's never successful in doing that. So you're right, he doesn't go to the parties, but the party he does go to is his compensatory behavior by going on to the holodeck and creating a situation that he controls.
So, you know, that's an interesting element because we've talked about the holodeck so many times before, and I think this is obviously another time where the show and we are going to talk about, but both we and the show I think are coming at this from a very different angle for the first time. The show uses the holodeck as a narrative tool that, focuses a storyline. We rarely ever see the holodeck spoken of kind of as something uh, that has an effect in the outside world. Like there's always this expectation that when Data takes off the deer hunter hat when he's Sherlock
Hmm.
Holmes, he goes back to being Data. He doesn't
Hmm.
keep thinking about being Sherlock Holmes once he's out of the holodeck.
Hmm.
You have a character now who is suffering from an intense hollow addiction because it's the only way for him to cope with his massive anxiety, to the point where he's actually becoming derelict in duty, that when he becomes so uncomfortable he runs to this place. um you and I once talked early on in season 1 about how the holodeck is probably a very needed psychological tool to deal with the rigors of space, because you're in the Enterprise D, and even though it's this massive ship, you can't walk outside. You're kind of trapped in these corridors. If you're The reality is, if you're looking out into space, it's not this starry galaxy. It's the endless void that you probably sometimes see a star, sometimes see a planet, sometimes see something, but most of the time you're not seeing anything at all. You need the 3D aspect and the sensory aspect of a holodeck to stay sane. Here, however, and maybe this is the part of the conceit of the show where we're talking about characters with anxiety in space, because in the real world, I don't think this character actually gets here, but the holodeck itself has now become so needed by certain members of the crew, they've developed an addiction to it.
Well, the and Jordy, even when he falls in love
Yes,
with what's her name,
Leia
the
Brom,
engineer,
Dr. Leia
Leah
Brahms.
Brahms. He realized he had a problem and he had to pull back and break the addiction. And he talks to
Yes.
Reg about that, to Barclay about that. And it's interesting you bring this up for two reasons. One, I had this friend of mine who is a physician, and during the pandemic, he's from Fredericksburg, Virginia, but he's retreated to some house, I don't rent it or something, like on the south shore of the Potomac River in Virginia, where Chesapeake Bay meets. And on a non-municipal or state maintained road. Barely has any internet, and he has good cell coverage. He may go there. I talked to him on Monday, and he said that he may have go 2 weeks without seeing a three-dimensional person
Mm-hmm.
because he's looking at TV or something on his phone, and he sometimes be a week and he'll see a boat pass a couple hundred meters out of the river in the bay. And the
Mm-hmm.
other thing is there's a holiday issue, a double issue of The Economist that you'll get soon as I finish reading,
Mm-hmm.
and I've got the next stack to send you. And there's an article in there about how astronauts in the future, particularly if they go to Mars or longer missions,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to have to be different because of, they're going to be in a tight space. We talked about
Yes.
this. How big can these ships be? How much space do they have? If you have, 6 people or 4 people, whatever, on a crew, and they're months going to Mars, their conflicts are going to come up. And
Yes.
so the article really ends up talking about how important managing the mental health of the astronauts, the taikonauts, the cosmonauts, whatever you want to call them, are. And
Yes.
this is where what you're getting to is in the 24th century, in this science fiction world, the holodeck really may have a very important mental health function if it's properly used.
And that's the hard thing because this is the sort of addiction that only works in a sci-fi fantasy world. Actually, not true. Um, there's a lot of people who talk about, a lot of people who have social anxiety retreat into things like video games, and they retreat into things like um, their online life, whether it's social media. Social media really has become the bulwark for the socially awkward and the socially anxious, where it allows them a voice and a place to be free. And I can say, as someone who I think at one point suffered some social anxiety in like middle school and high school, um, I can understand how the internet allows you a sense of anonymity. And just like the holodeck for Barclay allows him a sense of freedom to do things that he couldn't do in the real world. I think the internet and video games, especially now with like the competitive multiplayer games that I used to play and your son-in-law plays, that I think that allows people a level of escape that can
Mm-hmm.
become very addictive. The
Mm-hmm.
difference is, you have to turn off the video game at some point. Um, you have to you have to put down the controller. You have to walk away from it. With the holodeck, you can literally walk from the hallway of the Enterprise into your reality and walk out, and it's seamless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So where's the real line between reality
Mm-hmm.
and illusion?
And actually, the Moriarty episodes, which
Yes.
really, really emphasize that point because the line's completely gone in those
Well,
episodes.
it brings into question, I think that we are obviously dealing with Barclay suffering from a holosuite I'm sorry, a holodeck addiction or holo addiction, and him trying to deal with his mental health. But there's some real like ethical and moral concerns taking place here that we can get into. For example, and the regular actors, you made a note that the regular actors must have had a lot of fun in this episode. And I agree. There's a lot of characters that are allowed to stretch their wings, like Picard, Geordi, and Data play like the bumbling version of the Three Musketeers. Wesley's little boy Blue eating blueberry pies all day. A lot of fun things that you see different actors take on in Barclay's holodeck universe. But one thing that happens when Riker's finally fed up with Barclay being late is Troy, and Geordi storm into Holodeck 2 where Barclay has retreated in another fit of panic. And they finally start discerning and looking at all of his characters. And Riker at one point says there should be restrictions about replicating or modeling
Mm-hmm.
holodeck characters after crew members, and Geordi's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then at one point like, Deanna, Riker's about to delete characters, and Deanna stops him and is like, wait, that could be really psychologically harmful because this is clearly a place of psychological safety for him, and if you start doing that, you don't know what kind of harm that will bring. And of course, she finally sees the gods of empathy, and Riker has to stop her from deleting her character. But you bring up Moriarty, and I wanted to say all that because when you brought up Moriarty, Moriarty does bring in some real ethical and moral issues because when you start interacting with these holographic figures and you create reproductions or replications of people, and you start doing things like, Barkley beats up Riker and Geordi at the beginning of this episode, like kicks their asses. Like, what's the line where you're harming a hologram, or
Well, he,
you're acting out an animus, is
well,
what I'm trying to
yes,
say.
and if there's and
Especially if you're suffering from holo addiction, and that's where you go to like process your
like
emotional deficiencies
Riker
or
Riker
your
says
limits.
Riker says there ought to be a rule that you cannot inject a fellow crew member into a holodeck fantasy. And Geordi says, well, there isn't a rule for that. But it brings up a moral question of suppose, let's say that Barclay, who really is attracted to Deanna Troy, suppose he had a, um,
Yes.
played out a sexual fantasy with her. And that
Yes.
almost happens with Geordi and Leia Brahms. And, if somebody does that, is
And when the
that's
real Leah Brahms finds out, she's very angry and almost has a sense of feeling violated.
violated. And that's what, so if you create a sexual fantasy with a crew member and the crew member doesn't
Yes.
know it, is that tantamount in some way to rape?
Well, especially if that crew member somehow later finds out, because all these files are being stored on the Enterprise
Right,
computer, and like
right.
people are stumbling on them sometimes. There's
Yeah,
episodes where they
right,
just stumble on these files.
right.
Hell, there's a file of Moriarty, sentient old Moriarty, just kind of wandering around the Enterprise databanks. Like,
Hmm.
there really is a lot of like tough questions being asked about what are the real limits of this thing, especially if you have to keep, as you noted, people psychologically in line to deal with the rigors of space travel.
And, there's another just quick side comment that I don't want us to get on the path, but it gets into the whole issue of the algorithms that social media and Google use
Yes.
to,
No,
to,
I
ma-
think that we should.
to manage what we see.
Well, I think that that is a really important thing, and I don't think it's a bad path to go down or something we should avoid. You know, when it comes to what is allowed to be depicted in a holodeck, when we see the 24th century, for the most part, what have we seen so far? We've seen, okay, we saw Riker at a jazz bar, pretty benign. Data and Picard like to go in there and do Shakespeare. I know Miles O'Brien likes to go kayaking. Picard likes to go horseback riding sometimes.
Picard likes to play out his Dixon Hill fantasy.
Right. It seems like most people, while they're taking part in stuff that might be action packed, like Wesley goes on a school field trip, I think, to like Alaska or something.
Hmm.
Early in season one. Uh, the very first episode when they reveal it, I think Data is just hanging out in a tree whistling or trying to
Hmm.
whistle.
Right.
For the most part, the 24th century, I think what people create in the holodeck is a reflection of the society that they're bringing inside of it. And you see a society of people that are very interested in literature and art and culture and experience. And they all have this kind of positive outlook. And maybe that's the conceit of the show. In the real world, you know, I think when you brought up the worry of like people replicating sexual fantasies with crew members and not knowing. What about I brought up Barkley fighting Riker and Geordi. What if he goes in there every day and murders everyone? Or
Hmm.
let's say you had
Hmm.
one thing that people used to accuse video games of in the wake of the Columbine shootings is that video games spurred people to violence. Now, we know from research that that is not the case at all, that video games actually help mediate certain violent behaviors. But what if you had someone going into the holodeck and just murdering people every day? Where's the line? And Troy says this, and I think it's a good place for us to go. There's nothing wrong with a healthy fantasy as long as you don't let it take over.
Hmm.
If th- Let's take Troy's perspective. If someone does something untoward or potentially morally or ethically wrong in the holodeck, but they don't do it outside the holodeck and they don't do it to other living people. I know we've established previously that holodeck beings are possibly sentient beings or becoming sentient beings. But let's say they're not. Let's say they're not for a second. We can establish somewhere in a future universe where we have this sort of technology that they are not. Um, do you think it's still a good thing that we have that people have this ability to go out and I mean there are places here in New York and there's places in Japan where like you can go into rooms and like throw plates at walls and shit and like
Hmm.
break stuff. There's places you can go and do that, but is it good to like have places where you could enact murder or gross sexual fantasies or even play characters from like the worst parts of history? Like, okay, here's a really taboo question that will discomfort some of our listeners. But Data plays Sherlock. How many people play Adolf Hitler in their holosuite? Like, go in there, dress as Hitler, say the lines, do the speeches, have their little like Mein Kampf fantasy.
I haven't said anything because I really can't answer the question because it's so complex. I think it depends on, you know, where the individual is coming from,
Right.
why they have the need to fantasy. Is it purely escape? Is it purely a compensatory behavior? Or is it based on pathology of some sort? And I don't have a PhD in psychology or psychiatry, so that's kind of as far as I can go. I don't know if I can really give a decent answer to the question at all.
I actually think
But it's good that we've brought this up because obviously, from our conversation, talking about AI and how you've got computers very rapidly creating content for us based on what we choose to view online. It's
absolutely.
something that I'm sure that there are social scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists that are studying this to try to figure out what unrealized rabbit hole we're going down.
So it's interesting that you brought that up because social science does look at this in terms of like the movements of technology. One thing that has been very disturbing in the modern era, well, disturbing depending on what stance you take this from, but you can always tell that there's going to be a big media shift when porn takes up a medium. And this is something that you've actually seen. Like, we went from now. Correct me if it was before there were VHS. It was Betamax, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So like, porn literally went from like snuff films on 8 millimeters to VHS,
mm-hmm.
and literally started the VHS market. They did the same thing with DVDs. They did the same thing with streaming. Um, Literally, there is a ton of evidence out there and tons of research showing how porn kind of leads the way
And
in modern Western world in terms of like moving us from medium to consumer medium
and isn't there more porn watched, more porn content on the internet than anything else?
more than anything. It's honestly speaking as a quote unquote elder millennial and as someone who knows what Gen Z is dealing with. You know, people often try to talk about what's the biggest difference between like your generation, which are quote unquote the boomers or
Mm-hmm.
Gen X, or um, the millennials that I come from. I think that the biggest thing that the internet brought to my generation and has ultimately changed um, Gen Z, and it's made us very different from Gen X. And I said this in a previous episode, and I think when we were talking about like the social mores around sex last time,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, Gen X was the first generation, my older sister Michelle's generation, because of places like MTV, VH1, Nickelodeon. They were the first generation to actually talk to their youth and my youth at the time about safe sex, HIV/AIDS, um, homosexual relationships. We back then in the 90s when we were first talking about this, we were just talking about gays and lesbians. We weren't really talking about the trans community or what it meant to be queer or non-binary. That stuff literally wasn't for another 15 years, but
Mm-hmm.
Gen X did a lot to make people aware of safe sex. And porn was something that a lot of people knew about, especially in like my cousin. You're at their house, but my cousin Big J's generation, like
Mm-hmm.
they had Playboy magazine and they had Hustler, but they didn't have like the internet like
Mm-mm.
elder
Mm-mm.
millennials like me did. We
Mm-hmm.
were the first generation to have the internet, and I literally saw it from seventh grade. I remember when one kid literally went on to a school at the library and started looking at porn, because back then they didn't have the filters in schools at the libraries to deal with
Mm-hmm.
it. And that was seventh grade. So when you're exposed to that seventh grade and people are starting to do things that they see on screen in their
Mm-hmm.
private lives,
Mm-hmm.
it really changes like how people view healthy sexual behavior and then also healthy romantic relationships,
Mm-hmm.
where so much of today's culture, and Margot and I say this to each other a lot, that we're lucky that we found each other when we did, because there's a very good chance with today's culture, which is quote unquote hookup culture, that we would, if we had met in college, not a good chance we would have gotten together. A lot of elder millennials who haven't gotten married by now suffer from fraught sexual relationships, somewhat because of their porn use, but also because of just the general economic and social climate. But porn itself has really wrecked how men view women and how to have proper relationships with women, but it's also shifted how like women look at themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because just as many women are watching porn now as men. So
Mm-hmm.
like the fantasy or living out these fantasies online, just like um Barclay lives out his fantasies in the holodeck, are having generational repercussions. So, getting back to the episode, because I know this is a long way around,
Mm-hmm.
by the time Barclay's developing his hollow addiction, we have to assume that, like, the fact that Jordy brings it up and even Jordy is able to recognize that, he fell in love with the Leia Brahms hologram in a previous episode means that there is a future in the 24th century where, like, maybe my generation and Gen Z haven't learned the lessons of what we're going through now in terms of our ready access to sexualized content, but there's an awareness, at least by Jordy and to a certain extent by Reg, that like hollow addiction is a real thing and something to be worried about, because they say it out loud, like hollow addiction. um
Mm-hmm.
my real question, and this is where I think the episode, and I know I always begin the episode by asking you what you think of it. um I guess we're going to get into that part right here now. I think this is not a good episode, and I'll tell you why. I think for the most part they introduce a good character and they give him two really great challenges. First, he has to get out of the holodeck and like rejoin the world. The second is he has to show himself as a valuable member of the Enterprise crew, which he does through the Invidium storyline, where they discover that there's been this contamination from this broken canister and that Invidium is spread through the ship. And the way they deal with that is they kind of freeze it out of the system. So, covering that part of the storyline,
Mm-hmm.
the reason why I think this um, episode fails is because they never actually get Barkley to keep going to therapy. They just get him out of the holodeck long enough to show him that he can do something. It doesn't actually deal with the problem itself. He's still going into the holodeck and he's still retaining programs. It's very clear that he's hollow addicted, but by the end of this episode, they haven't done anything to actually deal with the addiction itself. it's actually kind of left very open ended.
Well, that's a good point because one of my notes is that when Barclay plays out on the holodeck his decision to leave the Enterprise, he goes onto the bridge and thanks everybody for the time there and
Yes,
tolerating him. It's a way of him doing what Geordi suggested when he has to separate himself from his dependency on his fantasy creation. However, as he says, delete program such and such, except section 15 or something like that. So he's still hanging on to a piece of it.
yes. Oh
And
yeah, program 9.
program nine. So he's still hanging on to a piece of it. And I don't know whether this hollow addiction for Lieutenant Barclay shows up in future episodes. I don't remember,
It
but
does.
it does. So, as you say, I mean, his hollow addiction is so severe that it really does call for some continuing counseling, some support to get, for him to really deal with. It's something that he can't deal with on his own.
Well, the difficult truth of this, and again, this is where we have to deal with the conceits of the show.
Right.
Not everyone is probably ready for space, and there's probably people that I know this. Barclay is probably someone you could never actually send up there.
Well, and that gets back to the article that I was talking about is that the indirect implications is that and and this is there was something where like the original Mercury astronauts and getting into Gemini and Apollo, they even the first moon voyages, they were short enough that they could be mainly military pilots. They needed to find people that had the right stuff, as the
Yes.
Tom Wolfe book and movie goes. But now that we're moving
If
into
if I may for a second, aka someone willing to die.
yeah, like when they went on the aircraft carrier and recruited Alan Shepard, he said, "Is it dangerous?" They said, "Yes, it's really dangerous." And he goes, "I'm in." And
Exactly.
and and now we're moving into a phase where if you're going to have a longer voyage to Mars or you know other planets in the solar system, the psychology of people you're choosing to be astronauts is very different. I mean, I'm just thinking the one person that I kind of paid attention to, there was that first women extravehicular activity team on the International
Yeah.
Space Station last year. Christina Koch, who's from North Carolina, went to NC State. Um, she's a scientist. Of course, she's trained to be a pilot and all that sort of thing, but she's not a military jock. She's a
Yeah.
scientist. And if you look at the mission specialists on the ISS now, they're not military guys. They're scientists. They're physicians and
Right.
so on. And just the type of training that's different from the military. Their whole psychological makeup is going to be different, and that indicates that the selection, the right stuff for astronauts in the future is different from what it was in the 60s and 70s.
So I think you bring up a lot of really great, wonderful points. I think that I think you bring up the issue of set and setting, especially when it comes to Barclay. You know, bringing up the ISS, you're right. It is for the most part, like there are quote unquote military personnel there, but military in the sense that like these people were once in the military and then they moved on to like
Yeah.
other
Yes.
to their main discipline, which is
Right.
usually in the sciences or
Right.
mathematics or
Right.
computer sciences. Like the
Yes.
military was just part of their career; it's not their career, which is
Right.
the which is the difference here. And because for everyone in the Enterprise, especially in Starfleet, Starfleet is kind of a military, even though they say it isn't.
Well,
It is their career.
and the other thing is, if you look at some of the original Mercury astronauts, after they did their initial, you know, uh, missions, they got out of the military and they became part of NASA and they became
Hmm.
program specialists. And I think Gordon Cooper did that.
Hmm.
Alan Shepard did that. There was one, Deke Slayton, I think, was an astronaut who turned into an aquanaut. He started exploring the oceans and so on.
Really?
And yeah, I think it was Deke Slayton. It may have been I forget which one, but again, they shifted away from being military pilots to being having an academic engineering interest in further developing space travel. And one of those original Mercury 7 actually became a aquanaut, to use that term.
Yeah. Well, like it's also important to note that like NASA has also gone to the creative arts a lot. Connecting this directly to Star Trek, Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, um, after Star Trek, stayed on with NASA as a program specialist to help recruit women into
That's right.
NASA.
That's right.
Now, one thing I did want to talk about and ask you about when it comes to like the potential trauma of sending people into space, and I really want to read that article you mentioned, but one thing that happened in 1996 was the Challenger explosion. And I think that the
86. Right.
86. Um, to me, the Challenger explosion is always reported in history as this huge tragic event because I think I can't remember her names. It's Sally something, but she was
No,
going to be one of the first.
Christina McAuliffe was the teacher.
Yeah, okay, Christina McAuliffe. Um, when that happened in '86, it seems, at least from the way it was taught to me, is that it was such a traumatic moment in American history, or at least for us as a public, that space travel became something that we lost interest in. And there's a word, and since we were no longer like competing with the Russians for space travel, like there was no real impetus anymore to continue, like, direct manned flights into space. But the reason I bring this up, if we were to send people to Mars or send people to Saturn or Europa, we would have to contend with the idea that we send someone up in a rocket again, and like midway to Mars, that fucker blows up and everyone aboard's dead, and that's just if it's
Well,
$1 trillion to send them there, that's just $1 trillion in the hole we're not getting back. Um,
I think you're elucidating the key point is that there were no other than the Apollo 1 accident, which was a simulation of the Apollo capsule on the ground where Grissom, White, and Chaffee, I think they were the three astronauts, they had a pure oxygen environment in the capsule while it was
mhm.
sitting on the ground. And there was a short and a spark, and it just fried them, just, flash fire. And, but those three men didn't die in space. So Challenger
And
was
then
the first
Apollo
time
13 happened, but that was those men survived.
they men survived, and that was a wonderful, innovative engineering that they made it back, and everybody celebrated. No one died. But when you
Yeah.
get to Challenger, that was the first time that American astronauts died in space. So what it pointed out was space is dangerous. And then, back in the what 90s or something, what was the other one that broke up because of the heat tiles kind of came off. It broke up
Oh,
over Texas. I forget which one that was. And I remember when Challenger uh, was lost in '86. Your sister Michelle was 5, and I asked her. I said, Michelle, would you ever want to go into space? And she said, no. And I said, why not? She said, this is a 5-year-old. She says, because spaceships blow up. So
yes.
here's a
Well, like
5-year-old
th- that was
realizing
the
that
two.
this is a dangerous thing.
You were referring to the 2003 Space Shuttle Columbia disaster.
The Columbia, right? Yes.
Yeah, but like that's the thing. Spaceships do blow up at some point. Even in the show, they blow up, and when they blow up, everyone's dead. Um, I think one thing about getting people ready to go to space is that we as a public would actually have to get ready to go to space and deal with the idea of like I don't know. In some ways, it seems like we talk about sending people into space and who the characters would be, and what kind of people we want them to be. I think one question that we have to deal with is: are we ready as a society to send people out
Well,
there?
here's a question for you. I mean, is Blue Origin and Virgin, whatever it is, Richard Branson's thing, they're suborbital flights. They go up and they experience, um,
I
you
think I know
know,
what you're going to ask, but
they,
go
they
on.
they they experience weightlessness for 3 minutes or something like that. They go up above the whatever line it's called, and they're 62 miles up or something like that. They come back. Is
Bullshit.
that Well, it is. We've talked about this, and
Yeah.
but is that preparing the public that you can go into space? And so far, nothing's untoward has happened. So they're showing it space. I think what really needs to happen is you need to get some civilians with minimal training to get on a Falcon rocket and go on
Yep.
the Dragon and go into
Yeah.
orbit and go onto the ISS and work out there and survive that and come back. And
Yep.
that's where space travel will start to be normalized for the quote unquote general public.
So here's the thing. I don't want to say that what Blue Origin and Richard Branson are doing is bullshit.
No, not at
Especially if
all.
if either of men are listening to these things and want to give us a ride.
Right.
Kidding. Jeff Bezos has never given me a ride in his penis rocket. Um, and I'm
Yes.
sorry, I'm not getting in it because it looks like a penis rocket, and
Right.
that man abuses
It's
his workers.
it's
Anyway,
right out of Austin Powers, and Jeff
it
Bezos
really
looks like Doctor Evil.
I I have to wonder if like does this man really have friends? Because if I had friends, I would want someone to stop and like midway through the design and be like, "Hey, you know that's a dick, right?" Like if you
Exactly.
had friends, you would hope that they would say that. Anyway, when it comes to Bezos, he did that thing with Shatner, and Shatner had the overview effect where
Mm-hmm.
like he saw the barrier between the nothingness of the void and the atmosphere of Earth, and Shatner had the effect, I think, because Shatner actually has a soul.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the fact that
And
Bezos goes up
right.
there and still doesn't get it makes me think that like it isn't the same, it isn't the thing, and you have to be in the right mindset versus what you're offering, which I think is the real test. Like actually pull those people past the atmosphere, like put them into the void. That's what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Like get them
Mm-hmm.
out into space.
And even there's supposed to be a space is supposed to have this metallic
Yes.
smell to it, and you even
Yes,
get
like
that
burnt meat.
you get that on the ISS. So
Hmm.
experience that you're in a completely, truly alien environment.
Yeah. No, I think that you have to do that. I also think that and I think it's one thing that NASA talked about during the Trump administration, um, that I thought was a good thing for them to put out there. But like, I think the moment we colonize the moon and we actually start sending people to the moon, this becomes real for people. And like space travel will be something because I'll be honest, Mars is such a long shot still, and I have doubts about it because there's this wall of radiation you have to get past that we don't know if we can. And every available astrophysicist and engineer says, until you figure this out, there's nothing to figure out. I think establishing a lunar colony is honestly our safest bet moving forward.
I,
Um,
I'd have
and,
to
it,
agree.
and it's
I think
probably
it
going to
makes
be the
sense.
jumping off point to
Yes.
Mars.
Yes. Right.
Um, the the person that I'm conflicted about him a lot, and people will know that I'm conflicted about him a lot because on one hand, Elon Musk is Tony Stark in real life, and I think
Mm-hmm.
Tony Stark's a big fucking problem. That's
Mm-hmm.
a dude with a god complex that can make weapons if he wants to. He's just
Mm-hmm.
deciding not to. We got
Mm-hmm.
lucky in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Elon Musk has gotten so powerful and so rich as the richest man in the world that he's starting to flaunt governments. And
Mm-hmm.
he's starting to do it publicly and say things to governments now, and like no one's saying anything. And for me, as someone who doesn't believe in God, who believes in gods and acknowledges that kings exist, but believes that gods and kings should not rule, that's fucking terrifying what Elon Musk is able to
Mm-hmm.
do. That being said, you and I never lived with a Howard Hughes in our lives. I have to imagine this is somewhat what it's like to live with a Howard Hughes because we don't remember Howard Hughes in history like we should, but he really did push forward so many things that were innovative to our culture now. From not only from like you know aero engineering, but from like the way movies are produced to the way media is consolidated. The only reason we really have competition in airlines is because Howard Hughes got in there and created competition,
Yeah.
and kept competition going.
Hmm.
Um, there should be an argument that Howard Hughes was the first one to prove that you could take something of a gargantuan or immense size and actually launch it into the air and make it create lift. Um, Elon Musk is in many ways doing what Howard Hughes did, but 1,000 times more,
Hmm.
because this guy literally took his money and he's wasted it on these rockets. That he almost went bankrupt multiple times. Every time these rockets failed, it was almost bankruptcy for Tesla. It was almost bankruptcy for SpaceX. And this dude did the hard work that you and I have been talking about, like getting ready for the risks of space. And he's been taking those risks.
Well,
Um,
and there's been commentary about Musk is that what his really mission is to uh, establish a human colony on Mars.
I
And
think
it's sort of
he,
like it's an opportunity for humans to start again, even.
well, I think he'd take Stephen Hawking seriously when Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan says that our future as a human race is only assured is if we can migrate and colonize off this planet.
Hmm.
And that's true. Um, I argue that the only way that our race, survives is if we get out of our solar system and colonize the planet. Um, because if this sun goes, we're fucked, and
And
if
we
we
got
get
and
hit
we
by a
got plenty
meteor,
of
we're
and we
fucked.
got plenty of time. The meteor
I
comet
know.
collision's a different story, right?
Well, we're actually starting to experiment with that now with at
Yes.
DARPA and NASA in terms of how we can mitigate that. Um,
There's supposed to be a streaming movie coming on either Netflix or Prime tomorrow with DiCaprio about some
yes.
collision. Yeah.
Well, you know what? Kind of getting back to Musk, the thing about what he's doing that is so important is that he is pushing the boundary in ways that, like, I don't think governments today can when it comes to space exploration. You brought up the idea, not the idea, the reality of, like, we needed to find people that had the right stuff. That was during a competition with a foreign power that was launching satellites into orbit and sending monkeys into space. Like, the Russians were going crazy and doing crazy stuff. We had to meet them with crazy shit too. And our answer to that was like, "Oh, you're sending a dog and a monkey? We're sending a dude."
Well, the
Um,
Russians did that first.
no, true. Um, but my point is that, like, we've always been focused on, like, getting people there. Um, Musk is doing this at a time where, like, governments don't have any competition. We essentially have a global marketplace where everyone wants to work together, even though we act like we don't. And when we do, like, we're working with the Chinese government with their space program up there in the ISS, just like we're working with the
No,
Russians
no,
and
no,
other
no.
nations.
They won't let the Chinese go into ISS because they don't want to share some of the technology with them.
Well,
Matter of
who's
fact,
up on the ISS right now?
the Russians and Japanese and Europeans and that sort
India's
of thing.
up there. The
I
U.S. is
think the
up
Indians
there.
have been up, but they have not let the
No,
Chinese.
The Indians have been up.
Yeah, but the Chinese have not been allowed on the ISS, and that's why the Chinese are now starting to build their own space station, and they've even talked to the Russians about doing something jointly, because the Russians
I've heard about the Russians doing
with
something
the, with
jointly.
the,
I
with
did.
the with the deteriorating relationship between Russia and the U.S. The Russians don't want to long term put more money into the ISS.
I can't believe I missed out that China wasn't allowed on the ISS.
Yeah, they
Huh.
aren't. They aren't. They've not been on the ISS.
See, I knew about Russia wanting to back out on the ISS because of our deteriorating relationship with them, but at the same time, uh, I think that is going to prove such. It's going to have such short term gains for them and
I
such long term
I think
losses
the
that
whole
they're going to
thing
turn around
is
and turn
it
10 years and regret
it
doing
is
it.
it people. It's another example of the problems we're facing on this planet.
Hmm.
And I'll list three: uh, the politics of brinksmanship, pandemic, and climate
Hmm.
change. And if you deal with those problems, the only way they can be solved if we do it from a planetary, a whole species perspective. If you start to get beyond that, if you really, when you say that the only way that the species survives is to get off this planet or colonize some other planet outside of the solar system, which involves interstellar travel, then the resources available to do that cannot be done by the United
Hmm.
States or the Soviet or the Russians or the Chinese alone. It has to be something done as a species. And
Well,
no one, very few people understand that right now. We can do more things together than separately. And that,
well, I think the thing is that most of us do understand that intrinsically. I think the problem, both it domestically and internationally, is that we have suffered under generations of deteriorating leadership,
hmm
and I think it's really the leadership that like we really face in all this.
I would have to agree with that right now. Yeah.
But and this will be the last thing that we talk about. One of the things I think that is saving Barkley in this episode, and this will be the last thing we talk about, is the actual leadership of the people around him, especially Jean-Luc Picard, who,
hmm
despite having the incident where he calls Barclay broccoli, which is a kind of pejorative that's been developed by the crew for the lieutenant, Picard goes out of his way to try to really like integrate Barkley into the crew, saying like, he might be socially awkward, but like his captain did say he was a good diagnostic engineer. It's our job to be the best in the fleet, and part of being the best in the fleet is being able to work with anyone, which I think is a very interesting viewpoint from an early 1990s perspective versus today, where there really is this kind of push like if you don't want to work with someone, you don't have to, and you don't need to do the work of learning to compromise and work with someone else.
Oh, oh, yes, which really applies to politics now.
Yes.
hmm
um I think that it's leadership like Picard's that ultimately like keeps things like Barkley from getting out of control. um it's always someone saying like, hey, you need to watch out for this person, even if you don't like them, even if you think they're strange. They're still part of this crew, they're still part of this family. I think the character of Jean-Luc Picard does a really good job for the small amount of time that they give him in this episode, and becomes a very
hmm
important character without having to be the central
hmm
character.
hmm
um Dad, it's late, and I think we've had a really great episode. Um, is there any final thoughts that you would like to give about Pursuits before we go?
No, I have to disagree a little bit. I think it's a good episode just on the basis that, um, if people really carefully view it and think about it, and if they come to have some of the same considerations we have, understanding the world in which we live right now, it can be very valuable for individual or like almost a Starflag episode club to consider, what the ramifications are out of this episode, what it's saying about human psychology and where we are with, um, how we, as we're getting into this metaverse, that whole
Mm-hmm.
concept, how, I mean, the metaverse
Oh,
is
great
very
point.
much holodeck. So I think
Yes.
that it's actually, um, you know, science fiction talks about the future, and here is an episode in 1990 that is brings up some issues and questions very applicable and very cogent to 2022.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to leave it there, and I'll let you have the last word
Okay,
on that. I think that's a
it's,
very
yeah,
I think that's a very great view of this episode. And especially I didn't even really consider the meta universe, but the metaverse aspect, but we'll touch on that in a later episode down the
Okay,
road.
sure.
Dad, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be back next time for Star Trek Season 3, Episode 22. One of the more interesting ones, and I think one that we'll have a very deep ethical conversation about in the Most Toys. Until then, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Dad, thank you so much. Everyone at home, happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Jay. Merry Christmas to you too.
Okay, everyone. Dad, I love you so much. See you
All
soon.
right. Bye bye.